My grandmother had been dead for exactly 3 days when I found out she had apparently uninvited my brother from his own home. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of it. I am not a woman who cries easily. I spent 12 years training my eyes to catch the difference between a genuine 17th century signature and a clever forgery sold at auction for 6 figures. I have held letters written by people who have been dead for 300 years and felt nothing but a calm, careful curiosity about the way the ink had faded, the way the paper had aged, the way a hand moves when it is telling the truth versus when it is performing one. My job is to notice what other people miss. My job is to stay steady when everyone else in the room is convinced of something that simply is not so. I tell you this now because I need you to know that when I say I sat on my grandmother's kitchen floor and cried until my throat gave out, I mean it cost me something to admit that. I do not do that. I did it that day. The kitchen still smelled like her. That is the detail nobody warns you about. Not the silence of the house, not the coat still hanging by the door, not the reading glasses folded neatly on the side table where she always left them. It is the smell. Coffee and lavender hand cream and the particular dust of old paperbacks that never quite goes away no matter how many windows you open. I stood in that kitchen breathing in a woman who no longer existed anywhere except in the walls of a house that, according to the document folded in my hand, no longer belonged to either me or my brother. Let me back up, because you deserve the whole shape of it, not just the wound. My name is Mara Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I appraise rare manuscripts and historical documents for an auction house that specializes in things people are willing to spend absurd amounts of money on to prove they touched history. I am good at my job. I am good at it because I was trained by my grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, long before any university got their hands on me. She was a retired archivist who spent 40 years working with the County Historical Society, and she used to sit me down at her kitchen table when I was 8 years old and show me how a real signature breathes and a copied one holds its breath. She would trace her finger along old letters and say, "Watch how the pressure changes, watch where the hand slows down. A forger is always thinking too hard about the shape and not hard enough about the feeling." I did not know, sitting at that table as a child, that those lessons would one day be the only thing standing between my brother and losing everything he had left of her. My brother is Denny. He is 31, 3 years younger than me, and he has cerebral palsy, which for him means he uses a wheelchair most days and needs support with certain daily tasks, though anyone who assumes that means he needs help thinking for himself has made a serious error in judgment and will regret it eventually, usually loudly. Denny has lived with our grandmother since he was 22, since the year our parents decided that caregiving was a job better suited to someone else's schedule than their own. Eleanor never once made him feel like a burden. She built a life around him instead of asking him to shrink to fit hers. She widened doorways. She installed a lift. She learned how to argue with insurance companies at a professional level. She used to say that raising Denny in her later years had given her more joy than raising my father ever had, and she said it laughing, but she meant every word of it. So when I tell you that Eleanor Whitfield loved my brother with a ferocity that reorganized her entire life around his safety and dignity, I need you to sit with that fact for a moment, because it is the foundation everything else in this story is built on top of. It is the reason none of us could make sense of what came next. It is the reason the whole thing felt, from the very first hour, like someone had taken a woman we knew completely and tried to fold her into a shape she never would have chosen. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in her sleep, at 83 years old, after a long slow decline that none of us pretended was going to end any other way. I do not tell you this part to dwell in grief. I tell you because her death itself was not the betrayal. Her death was simply sad, in the ordinary, unavoidable way that death is sad when someone has lived a long full life and it finally, gently, comes to a close. I had made my peace with that part months before it happened. What I had not made peace with, what none of us had any warning to prepare for, was what happened 3 days later in a lawyer's office with wood-paneled walls and a box of tissues nobody used. The family gathered for the reading of the will on a gray Thursday afternoon. My father was there, looking somber in the specific way people look somber when they are performing grief they did not do the work of earning. My Uncle Gerald sat beside him, Eleanor's older son, a man in his mid-50s who had spent the last decade building a modest real estate development business that, from the outside, looked successful in the way a stage set looks like a real house. I sat with Denny's wheelchair angled beside my chair, his hand resting on my forearm the way it always did in rooms that made him nervous. We were not expecting drama. We were expecting paperwork. Grief has a way of making you naive about what people are capable of, right up until the moment they show you. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Castellano who had represented Eleanor for almost 15 years, cleared his throat and began reading from a document that, within the first 30 seconds, made the entire room go still in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. The house, it said, along with the entirety of Eleanor Whitfield's savings and investment accounts, was to be left in full to her son Gerald Whitfield, in recognition of his care and companionship during her final years. I remember the specific silence that followed. It was not shock exactly. It was the sound of several people simultaneously trying to figure out if they had misheard something, and then simultaneously realizing they had not. Denny's name was not mentioned once in the entire document. Not the house he had lived in for 9 years. Not a cent toward the care facility deposit that Eleanor had covered like clockwork every single month without fail. Not so much as a sentence acknowledging that her disabled grandson existed and had built his entire adult life around the promise that this house would always be his safe place. I looked at Gerald. I want to be honest with you about what I saw, because it matters later. I did not see a man who looked surprised. I did not see a man scrambling to make sense of unexpected news the way the rest of us clearly were. I saw a man who looked relieved, the particular relief of someone who has been holding their breath through a long-anticipated moment and can finally exhale. I said his name out loud before I had fully decided to speak. Gerald. He did not meet my eyes. He said, very quietly, that Mom made her choices, and none of us had any right to question them now. I want to tell you that I stood up and demanded answers right there in that office. I did not. I sat frozen, one hand on my brother's shoulder, doing the thing I am best at in the entire world without even meaning to, which is noticing details. I noticed that the signature on the final page did not have the small looping flourish Eleanor always put on the tail of her L. I noticed the date was 6 days before she died, a time when, according to the nurse who had been checking on her twice daily, Eleanor had been largely bedridden and exhausted, not the kind of woman who drives herself to a lawyer's office to rewrite a lifetime of intentions on a whim. I noticed all of it, and I said none of it, because grief had made me doubt my own instincts, and because the room was already fracturing into 2 camps before Gerald had even finished not meeting anyone's gaze. My father, who has never in his life chosen the harder right thing over the easier convenient thing, immediately sided with his brother. He said, in the gentlest, most reasonable voice imaginable, that Gerald had, after all, lived closer, visited more often in the final stretch, handled some of the medical paperwork toward the end. He said, Mara, sweetheart, I know this is painful, but Mom was allowed to change her mind. He said it the way people say things they have already decided are true regardless of evidence, because believing it is easier than the alternative, which in this case would have required him to accuse his own brother of something monstrous. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even when it is inconvenient. My father was not lying to protect Gerald out of malice. He was lying to himself first, and Gerald simply benefited from it. That distinction did not make it hurt less. It made it hurt in a more complicated way, the kind of hurt that has no clean villain to point at yet, just a family quietly deciding that peace was more valuable than truth. Denny did not say a single word during the entire drive home. That silence frightened me more than any amount of shouting would have. My brother has never once in his life been someone who goes quiet when he is hurt. He argues. He makes jokes at the worst possible moments to defuse tension nobody else knows how to defuse. The silence in that car was a version of him I had never met before, and I hated every mile of it. That night, back at the small rental where I had been staying since flying in for the funeral, I got a call from the care facility where Denny had a standing arrangement for supplemental support services, The kind of professional and home assistance that made it possible for him to live with dignity and independence rather than in an institution. The woman on the phone was kind but businesslike. She explained that the automatic monthly payment, which had been drawing from an account tied to Eleanor, had failed to process. She asked, gently, if there had been some kind of change in the family's financial arrangements. I sat on the edge of a stranger's guest bed and did the math out loud to an empty room. 3 days. It had taken exactly 3 days for the structure Eleanor spent 9 years building around her grandson's safety to start quietly collapsing, while the man who inherited everything was, according to a friend of mine still in town, already meeting with real estate agents about listing the house for sale. I called Gerald that night. He did not answer. I called again the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding harried, background noise suggesting he was somewhere with hard floors and echoing walls, possibly the empty house itself. I asked him directly if he intended to help cover Denny's care costs given that our grandmother had covered them without fail for nearly a decade. He said, and I remember this sentence with the kind of precision I usually reserve for reading 400-year-old letters, that he had his own financial obligations to think about now, and that Denny's care was, quote, ultimately a matter for the state to help with going forward. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that about me. I have never once in my adult life raised my voice at a family member, not because I lack the capacity for anger but because I learned a long time ago that cold, precise questions unsettle guilty people far more effectively than heat ever does. I asked him one more question before hanging up. I asked him what, exactly, he thought our grandmother would say if she could hear him right now. He hung up without answering. I sat with that silence for a long time. By the end of that week, the shape of my life had rearranged itself into something I did not recognize. I was staying on a friend's couch because I had given up my temporary rental to save money, uncertain how long this fight might take. Denny's care facility had given us a 30-day grace period on the overdue payment, generous by any standard, but a clock nonetheless, ticking down toward a version of his future that terrified me every time I let myself think about it directly. My father had stopped returning my calls with the same speed he used to, which told me everything about which side of this he had quietly, comfortably chosen. And Gerald, according to a neighbor who still liked me enough to text me updates, had a realtor sign staked into the front lawn of my grandmother's house within 11 days of her funeral. 11 days. I want that number to sit with you the way it sat with me. 11 days from the moment we buried a woman who spent her entire retirement reorganizing her life around her grandson's safety, to the moment her older son had a for sale sign hammered into the grass she used to garden every spring. I remember standing on the sidewalk across the street from that house, staring at the sign, feeling something shift inside my chest that I can only describe as the sound of a door quietly closing on the version of me that gives people the benefit of the doubt. I was tired of being the reasonable one in a room full of people who had already decided the outcome before the conversation started. I was tired of watching my brother go quiet in a way that terrified me. I was tired, more than anything, of a growing, insistent feeling in the back of my skull, the professional part of my brain that had spent 12 years learning to see what other people overlooked, telling me that something about that was wrong in a way none of them wanted to examine too closely. That night I went back to the rental one last time to collect the last of my things before moving to my friend's couch permanently, and I found, tucked inside an old shoebox of cards Eleanor had kept in her closet for reasons only sentimental old women understand, a birthday card she had written me 4 years earlier. I sat on the floor with it for a long time, not crying this time, just looking. Looking at the shape of her handwriting the way I had been trained since childhood to look at handwriting, not reading the words so much as reading the hand that made them. The particular slant of her capital letters. The way her signature ended in a small looping flourish on the tail of the L, the same flourish that had been conspicuously, quietly absent from the will Mr. Castellano read aloud 3 days after her funeral. I sat there with that card in my hands and felt the last of my doubt evaporate, replaced by something colder and steadier. Not rage exactly. Rage burns too hot and too fast to be useful, and I have never trusted it. What I felt instead was clarity, the specific clarity that only arrives once you finally stop asking whether something is true and start asking what you are going to do about the fact that it is. I did not call my father that night. I did not call Gerald either. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a name I had not spoken to in almost 2 years, a name I knew from professional circles, a name that belonged to one of the most respected forensic document examiners on the East Coast, a woman my grandmother had mentioned to me once, almost in passing, months before she died, in a conversation I had not thought about since. Her name was Ruth Bellamy. I remembered the conversation now with a clarity that made my hands shake slightly as I typed out the message. Eleanor had called me on an ordinary Sunday evening, months before any of this began, and mentioned almost casually that she had been meeting with a document specialist about, in her words, some paperwork she wanted to make absolutely certain was airtight. I had not asked follow-up questions at the time. I had assumed she meant something dull and administrative, a trust document, maybe a property deed. I had not thought, even for a second, that my grandmother, sharp and careful until the very end, might have suspected something was coming and quietly, methodically prepared for it without telling a single one of us. I typed the message to Ruth with fingers that would not quite hold steady. I asked her one simple question. I asked if she remembered meeting with a woman named Eleanor Whitfield sometime in the past year. I did not expect an answer that night. Ruth Bellamy was not someone I knew well, more a respected colleague from conferences and professional overlap than a friend, the kind of person you nod to across a room rather than call at 11 at night. But something in me needed to ask the question out loud, needed to hear it exist somewhere outside my own head, before I let myself sleep on the couch that was, for the moment, the only place I had left to call mine. My phone buzzed 40 minutes later. I stared at the notification for a long moment before I opened it, the way you stare at a door before deciding whether you are ready for whatever is on the other side of it. Ruth's reply was short. 6 words that would end up reshaping the entire next 4 months of my life, though I could not have known that yet, sitting there on a stranger's couch at midnight with a birthday card still open on my lap and my grandmother's true handwriting staring back up at me like a promise nobody else in my family had been willing to keep. Yes. I remember Eleanor well. I read those 4 words 3 times before I set the phone down on my chest and stared at the ceiling of a room that was not mine, in a house that was not mine, thinking about a woman who had spent the last months of her life quietly protecting a grandson she loved more than her own comfort, from a son she must have somehow, painfully, already suspected. I did not know yet what Eleanor had told Ruth Bellamy in whatever meeting they had shared. I did not know yet how much of what was coming she had anticipated, or how carefully she had prepared for a version of events she must have hoped, right up until the end, would never actually happen. What I knew, lying there in the dark with my grandmother's real handwriting pressed flat against my chest, was that the woman who raised me had not simply left this world and left the rest of us to sort out the wreckage. She had left something behind for me to find. And for the first time in 11 days, I felt something other than grief and helpless fury settle into my chest. I felt the specific, quiet steadiness of someone who has just realized the fight is not over. It has only just begun. Ruth Bellamy agreed to meet me 3 days later at a small coffee shop near her office, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changes depending on the barista's mood. I had rehearsed a dozen different versions of how I would start this conversation, and every single one of them left my head the moment I saw her sitting near the window with a manila folder already resting on the table in front of her, as though she had been waiting for me to finally ask the right question for months. Ruth is not the kind of person who wastes your time with pleasantries when something serious is sitting between you. She is in her late 40s, silver threaded through dark hair she keeps cropped short and practical, the kind of woman who wears reading glasses on a chain around her neck because she has stopped pretending she has time to go looking for them every 10 minutes. I had known her professionally for years, the way you know brilliant people you respect but rarely see outside conference hallways and email chains about authentication disputes. I did not know her personally at all. I would learn, over the following months, that this was about to change in ways I could not have predicted sitting across from her that first afternoon with my hands wrapped so tightly around a coffee cup that my knuckles had gone pale. She did not make me ask twice. She opened the folder, turned it toward me, and told me that Eleanor Whitfield had walked into her office nearly 6 months before her death, alone, without an appointment, and asked her a very specific question. Eleanor had wanted to know, in plain terms, how a forensic examiner would go about proving a signature was genuine if someone, someday, tried to claim otherwise. I asked Ruth if my grandmother had said why she was asking. Ruth said Eleanor had been careful, deliberately vague, the way people are when they suspect something but do not yet have proof enough to say it out loud, even to a stranger being paid for discretion. But Ruth remembered one thing clearly. Eleanor had said, almost as an aside on her way out the door, that she loved her family very much, and that love did not always stop people from doing foolish things when they were frightened enough. I sat with that sentence for a long moment. It sounded exactly like her. It sounded like a woman who had spent her whole life finding the kindest possible language for the hardest truths, even when the truth involved her own son. Ruth had done more than simply meet with Eleanor once. She had authenticated an exemplar, a formal sample of Eleanor's true signature, attached to a trust document Eleanor was updating at the time, completely unrelated on paper to the will that would surface after her death. That exemplar was sitting in Ruth's files, dated, notarized, verified beyond any reasonable challenge. It was, Ruth explained, exactly the kind of clean comparison sample that made forensic document work possible in the first place. Without it, we would have been left arguing about vague impressions and old birthday cards. With it, we had something closer to a fingerprint. I asked her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, whether she would be willing to compare that exemplar against the signature on the will Gerald had produced. Ruth looked at me for a long moment before she answered, the kind of look I imagine she gives evidence before she commits to an opinion about it. She said she could not promise me what the results would show. She said her job was not to find what I wanted to find, it was to find what was actually there, and I needed to be prepared for either outcome before I asked her to begin. I told her I understood completely, and I meant it, though some small stubborn part of me had already decided which outcome I was expecting. It took her 4 days to complete a preliminary review, 4 days that felt longer than the entire month that preceded them. I spent that time doing the practical work of survival, the unglamorous labor grief never gets credit for. I picked up freelance authentication work to cover Denny's overdue care payment myself, working late into the night on documents that had nothing to do with my own family while my own family's future sat unresolved in a folder on a stranger's desk. I visited Denny twice, and both times I watched him try to look steadier than he felt, the same way I was trying to look steadier than I felt, two Whitfields performing calm for each other because neither of us could afford to fall apart at the same time. Ruth called me on a Thursday evening. I remember exactly where I was standing when the phone rang, in the cramped kitchen of my friend's apartment, a dish towel still in my hand, because I have found that grief carves these strange small details permanently into memory, the ordinary moments right before everything shifts. She did not make me wait through pleasantries. She said, Mara, I need you to sit down, and I said I was already sitting, which was a lie, and I sat down anyway because some part of me understood the moment deserved it. She told me that the signature on the will Gerald had submitted showed clear indicators of what forensic examiners call construction. Not a natural signature, produced in one fluid unconscious motion the way genuine signatures always are, but something built in careful stages, individual strokes that had been slowed down and retraced, the kind of hesitation that only appears when a hand is copying a shape rather than simply making one. She said the pressure patterns were inconsistent in ways that did not match Eleanor's natural writing rhythm at all, variations that suggested someone tracing over a faint underlying guide rather than signing freely. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, if she was certain. She said certainty is a word she uses carefully in her line of work, but that in her professional opinion, backed by 30 years of experience and a clean verified exemplar to compare against, the signature on that will was not produced by the same hand that signed the trust document 6 months earlier. She said, gently, that in 20 years of doing this work, she had rarely seen a forgery this careless paired with stakes this high, which told her something important about the person who made it. Whoever forged that signature had been rushed, desperate, or both. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after we hung up, the dish towel still balled in my fist, feeling something crack open in my chest that was not quite relief and not quite fury but some complicated third thing that did not yet have a name. My grandmother had been right to be careful. My grandmother had somehow known, months before any of us saw it coming, that this exact moment might arrive, and she had quietly built a door out of it for me to find. I did not go to the police that night, and I did not call Gerald either. I understood enough about how these things worked from watching Ruth's own professional world to know that a preliminary opinion, however confident, was not yet a courtroom weapon. It was a beginning, not an ending. I needed the estate frozen before Gerald could finish selling the house out from under my brother, and I needed it frozen through the actual legal system, not through a phone call full of accusations that Gerald could simply deny his way past the same way he had denied everything else so far. The next morning I hired an estate litigation attorney named Priya Desai, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended to me by a colleague who had gone through a similarly ugly inheritance dispute 2 years earlier. Priya listened to the entire situation without interrupting once, took careful notes, and then told me something that steadied me more than almost anything else had in the previous 2 weeks. She said that what I was describing, a forensic opinion indicating a forged signature combined with a suspiciously convenient timeline and a beneficiary already attempting to liquidate the estate at record speed, was exactly the kind of case courts take seriously when the petition is filed properly and filed fast. We filed the emergency petition 6 days later, requesting the court freeze all estate assets and halt any pending sale of the property pending a full forensic review. I remember sitting in Priya's office while she walked me through what would happen next, the notice that would be served to Gerald, the timeline for his response, the hearing that would eventually be scheduled. I remember feeling, for the first time since that gray Thursday in the lawyer's office, that I was no longer simply absorbing whatever happened to me and my brother. I was doing something. I was building the shape of a fight instead of standing in the wreckage of someone else's decision. Gerald called me the evening the petition was served. I almost did not answer. Some old habit of politeness nearly won out, the same instinct that had kept me quiet in Mr. Castellano's office weeks earlier. I let it ring twice more before I picked up, and I am glad I did, because the voice on the other end of that call was nothing like the harried, evasive man I had spoken to before. He sounded frightened. He said I did not understand what I was doing, that legal fees would eat through everything, that I was tearing the family apart over paperwork. I told him, very calmly, that the family had already been torn apart the moment he decided cutting his disabled nephew out of his mother's will was an acceptable price for whatever he needed that money for. There was a long silence on the line after that. I did not fill it. I have learned that silence, held carefully, tells you more about a person than almost anything they say to break it. He finally said, quietly, that I did not know what kind of trouble he was in. I asked him what kind of trouble he meant. He did not answer. He hung up instead, and something about the specific fear in his voice, the fear of a man who felt cornered rather than the arrogance of a man who felt untouchable, told me that whatever was driving this was bigger and more desperate than simple greed. I did not know yet what that trouble was. I only knew that the realtor's sign, according to my neighbor's texts, had quietly disappeared from the front lawn 3 days after the petition was served, the listing pulled without explanation, and that for the first time since the funeral, Gerald had lost a piece of ground he had assumed was already his. That was the first cost I made him pay. It would not be the last. Rock bottom did not arrive the way I expected it to. I had spent 2 weeks bracing for a single devastating blow, the kind of moment television trains you to expect, a slammed door or a screamed accusation. What actually happened was quieter and somehow worse, a slow accumulation of small losses that added up to something crushing before I even realized how deep the water had gotten. The first sign came from Denny's care facility. The 30-day grace period I had negotiated was closing in fast, and despite the frozen estate, despite the petition working its way through the courts, none of that money was accessible yet. Frozen assets do not pay overdue invoices. I had drained most of my own savings covering freelance shortfalls and legal retainer fees, and I sat down one night with a calculator and a stack of bills and understood, with a clarity that made my stomach hollow out, that I was 3 weeks away from not being able to cover my brother's care on my own. I did not tell Denny how close we were to that edge. I have spent my whole life trying to protect him from worry that serves no purpose except to frighten him, and this felt like exactly that kind of worry. But he is not a fool, and he has never once in his life failed to notice when I am carrying something heavy and trying to pretend I am not. He asked me directly, one evening while I sat beside his bed pretending to read a magazine I was not actually absorbing a single word of, whether we were going to lose the fight. I did not lie to him. I have never lied to my brother, and I was not going to start in the middle of the worst thing either of us had ever lived through. I told him the truth, that it was going to be close, that the legal process moved slower than either of us wanted, and that I did not yet have a full answer for how we were going to bridge the gap between now and whenever the court finally ruled. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I have carried with me every single day since. He said, "Mara, I would rather lose the house and keep you exhausted and fighting than keep the house and watch you give up on me the way everyone else in this family already has." I did not have a response for that. I simply held his hand until visiting hours ended, because some moments do not need words layered on top of them. The second blow came from my father. I had held out some small, stubborn hope that he would eventually see the forensic evidence and choose truth over comfort, choose his grandson over his brother. Instead, he called me to say that Gerald had confided in him, in confidence, that I was, in his words, destroying this family over money I never even needed, since my career was successful enough without an inheritance. I told my father that this was never about money. I told him it had never once been about money, that it was about a woman who spent 9 years building a safe life for her disabled grandson, and a son who tried to erase that safety within days of her funeral. My father said, quietly, that he did not want to hear any more accusations against his brother, and he hung up before I could say another word. I sat with that phone call for a long time, feeling something I can only describe as grief layered over grief, the particular ache of losing a parent who is still alive, who simply chose someone else's comfort over your reality. The third blow, the one that pushed everything past what I thought I could bear, came from Priya, my attorney, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She called to tell me that Gerald's own lawyer had filed a motion challenging the forensic evidence, arguing that a single examiner's opinion was insufficient grounds for freezing an entire estate, and requesting the court lift the freeze while the matter proceeded through standard channels. She explained, gently, that judges take these motions seriously, that there was a real possibility the freeze could be lifted, that Gerald could regain access to funds and property before we ever got a full hearing. I remember standing in my friend's kitchen after that call, staring at nothing, feeling the specific hollow exhaustion of someone who has been fighting so hard for so long that her body has started keeping a private ledger of the cost. I had lost my temporary home. I was draining savings I needed for my own future. My father had chosen comfort over truth. My brother was watching me carry all of it and trying, in his own quiet brave way, to carry some of the weight himself even though he had no way to. And now the one piece of solid ground I thought I had, the forensic evidence Ruth had found, was being challenged in a way that could unravel everything before we ever reached a courtroom. I sat on that kitchen floor for the second time in this story, though this time I did not cry. I had, somewhere in the previous weeks, run out of tears the way a well runs dry from overuse. What I felt instead was a strange, heavy stillness, the kind of exhaustion that sits underneath rage rather than on top of it. It was Ruth who called me back from that stillness, though I did not reach out to her that night expecting comfort. I called her because she was the only person in my life at that moment who had not, in some way, disappointed me, and I needed to hear a voice that was steady and honest even if it had nothing reassuring to offer. She picked up on the second ring, and something in my voice must have told her immediately how bad the day had been, because she did not ask me casual questions first. She asked me where I was, and when I told her, she said she was coming over, and I told her she did not need to do that, and she said, with a gentleness that undid something in my chest, that she knew she did not need to, and she was coming anyway. She arrived 40 minutes later with a bag of takeout neither of us really ate and sat with me on my friend's second-hand couch while I finally let myself say out loud everything I had been holding since the funeral. Not just the will, not just the legal fight, but the smaller griefs underneath it, the father who chose his brother, the family gatherings I would probably never be welcome at again, the terror of watching my brother try to be brave for my sake when he was the one who had lost the most. Ruth listened without interrupting, the same way she had listened when Eleanor walked into her office months earlier with a vague question and an unspoken fear. When I finally ran out of words, she did not offer empty reassurance. She said something instead that I have thought about many times since. She said that in her experience, the people who fight dirtiest are almost always the people who are most afraid of being exposed, and that a man filing a motion to challenge solid forensic evidence was not a man who felt safe. He was a man who felt cornered, and cornered people make mistakes. She was right, though neither of us knew yet how right she would turn out to be, or how much that particular mistake would end up costing Gerald in the weeks ahead. What I remember most about that night, more than the legal setback, more than my father's phone call, more than the exhaustion sitting like stone in my chest, is the quiet, steady way Ruth stayed until well past midnight, not because there was anything left to solve that night, but because she seemed to understand, without me having to explain it, that some kinds of heaviness are only bearable when someone else is willing to sit inside them with you instead of trying to talk you out of feeling them at all. She left close to 1 in the morning, and at the door she paused, turned back, and told me something simple. She said that Eleanor had clearly loved me enough to build a door out of exactly this kind of darkness, and that the least the rest of us could do now was walk through it together instead of alone. I did not know, standing in that doorway at 1 in the morning, that those words were the first quiet root of something that would grow slowly and steadily over the following months into the kind of closeness neither of us had been looking for and both of us would eventually be grateful to have found. I only knew, closing the door behind her, that for the first time in what felt like a very long time, I did not feel completely alone in the fight. And the next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had not expected, the specific clarity of someone who has hit the bottom of something and found, instead of nothing, a floor solid enough to stand on and push back up from. The turn had already begun the night Ruth stayed until 1 in the morning, but the escalating winds started 3 days later, when Priya called with news that changed the entire shape of the fight. The judge assigned to our case, a careful, unhurried woman named Judge Alvarez, had reviewed both the forensic opinion and Gerald's motion to lift the freeze, and rather than ruling immediately in either direction, she had ordered a second independent forensic examiner to review the will, along with a formal deposition of the notary listed on the document. This was not the outright victory I had been praying for, but it was something better than the alternative I had spent that terrible rainy Tuesday bracing for. It meant the freeze stayed in place. It meant Gerald could not touch a single dollar or list the house again while the court took a longer, harder look at exactly what he had submitted. I remember exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks when Priya read me that order over the phone. It was not the ending. It was, finally, the ground holding steady beneath us instead of shifting away. The second win arrived almost by accident, in the way the most important discoveries in my professional life often do. I had spent years developing a habit of double-checking small procedural details that other people waved past without a second glance, and something about the will had been nagging at me since the very first reading, a detail I had noticed but not yet had time to chase down properly. The notarization stamp on the final page looked slightly off to my trained eye, the ink a shade too gray, the impression a fraction too shallow compared to notary stamps I had examined professionally over the years. I mentioned this to Priya almost offhandedly during one of our calls, and she, being the kind of attorney who treats every offhand detail as potential ammunition, had her paralegal pull the official state registry of licensed notaries. What we found changed the entire momentum of the case. The notary listed on Eleanor's will, a man named Frank Doyle, had his license suspended 18 months earlier following an unrelated complaint, meaning that by the time this will was supposedly notarized, Frank Doyle had no legal authority to notarize anything at all. He was using an old stamp that should have been surrendered to the state the moment his license lapsed. Priya filed an emergency supplement to our petition within 2 days, laying out clearly that the will was not only forensically suspect but procedurally invalid on its face, notarized by a man with no legal standing to do so at the time. Gerald's attorney requested an emergency meeting the following week, and something in the tone of that request, urgent and clipped rather than confident, told Priya, and told me, that the ground beneath Gerald's own case had started shifting as violently as the ground beneath mine had been weeks earlier. I want to pause here and tell you what this cost Gerald, because that mattered to me as much as any legal victory. The frozen estate meant he could not access the money he desperately needed. The invalid notarization meant his legal position had gone from shaky to nearly indefensible. But more than either of those things, it meant the story he had been telling himself, and everyone else, the story where he was simply a son claiming what his mother had chosen to give him, was collapsing in front of people whose opinions he actually cared about. His own attorney, according to a comment Priya relayed carefully during one of our calls, had reportedly told him privately that continuing to fight the will at this point was no longer a legal strategy so much as a slow, expensive way of digging himself deeper. The third win came from an unexpected direction entirely, and it arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in Ruth's office reviewing the second independent examiner's preliminary notes, which, unsurprisingly, confirmed everything Ruth had found weeks earlier. My phone rang with a number I did not recognize, a Pennsylvania area code, and I almost let it go to voicemail before something made me answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Carol Anders, a bookkeeper who had, until 3 months earlier, worked for Gerald's real estate development company. She explained, carefully and a little nervously, that she had heard through a mutual acquaintance about the estate dispute, and she felt she needed to say something she had been sitting on uncomfortably since she left the job. She told me that in her final months working for Gerald, she had processed several loan documents showing his company was carrying an enormous balloon payment coming due, tied to a failed condominium project that had gone badly over budget 2 years earlier. She said Gerald had mentioned, more than once, in stressed offhand comments she had not thought much of at the time, that his mother's estate was, in his words, going to solve everything once she passed. I sat perfectly still while she spoke, feeling pieces of a puzzle I had not even known I was missing slide quietly into place. This was not simply greed dressed up as entitlement. This was a man drowning in a financial crisis of his own making, watching a specific, calculable deadline approach, and deciding, in a moment of desperation I could almost understand if it had not cost my brother so much, that forging his mother's signature was a smaller sin than losing everything he had built. I asked Carol if she would be willing to put any of this in a written statement for our attorney. She hesitated, understandably nervous about involving herself further, but ultimately agreed, saying that she had left that job specifically because she did not like the pattern of decisions she had watched Gerald make in his final desperate months there, and she did not want to carry the guilt of staying silent about something this serious. That statement cost Gerald something no amount of money could replace. It exposed, in his own former employee's words, that the story he was telling everyone, that he had simply been given what his mother wanted him to have, was a lie built on top of a financial collapse he had been hiding from his entire family for over a year. The fourth win, smaller than the others but somehow the one that settled something permanently in my chest, came the following week when Priya received formal confirmation that the balloon payment Carol had described was due in exactly 19 days. 19 days from the moment the estate freeze had gone into effect. Gerald had not simply been impatient or entitled. He had been racing against a clock only he could see, and every single win we had landed against him in the previous weeks had done more than slow him down legally. It had taken away the one resource that might have saved his company from collapse entirely. I remember sitting across from Ruth that evening, the two of us reviewing documents spread across her kitchen table because by that point our meetings had quietly, naturally migrated from her office to her home, and telling her that I finally understood the shape of what we were fighting. Not simple cruelty. Not cartoonish greed. A man who had built his entire identity around being successful, who could not bring himself to admit failure to his own family, and who had convinced himself, in the specific desperate logic of someone cornered, that his mother would have understood, would have forgiven him, would have wanted him saved even at the cost of the grandson she loved most. Ruth looked at me for a long moment across that table, the way she had looked at me the very first day in the coffee shop, and said something I have carried with me ever since. She said that understanding a person's motive does not require forgiving what they did with it, that Eleanor herself had clearly understood exactly this about her son, understood it well enough to quietly protect Denny months in advance without ever confronting Gerald directly, because she loved him too but trusted him not at all. I asked Ruth, somewhat abruptly, why she had stayed this involved, this late, this often, in a case that had long since moved past the point of simple professional obligation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a directness I had come to associate with everything about her, that she had watched me fight for my brother with a steadiness that reminded her why she had gone into this work in the first place, to help people who had been wronged prove it, and that somewhere in the last several weeks, watching that steadiness up close, this had stopped feeling like a case to her at all. I did not have a ready response for that. I simply reached across the table and let my hand rest over hers, and she did not pull away, and for a long quiet moment neither of us said anything else, because some things, once said honestly enough, do not need to be immediately followed by more words. I drove back to my friend's apartment that night with a strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope sitting alongside the exhaustion I had been carrying for weeks, hope not just for the legal fight, which finally felt like it was tilting in our direction, but hope for something quieter and more personal that I had not been looking for and had somehow found anyway, in a kitchen full of forensic documents, sitting across from a woman who had shown up at 1 in the morning simply because she said she would. The call came on a Monday morning, exactly 19 days after Carol Anders first phoned me, the same day, as it turned out, that Gerald's balloon payment had been due. I was standing in Ruth's kitchen pouring coffee when my phone rang with a number I recognized instantly, the office line for Mr. Castellano, the attorney who had read that first devastating will aloud in a room full of people who did not yet know how much they were about to lose. I almost did not answer, some old instinct still flinching at the sound of that particular office calling me. I am glad I did. Mr. Castellano's voice sounded different than it had in that first meeting, less formal, almost urgent. He told me he needed to see me in person, immediately, along with Priya if she was available, because something had come across his desk that he believed changed everything about this case, something he had been legally obligated to hold in confidence until now, and something he had been waiting, with growing unease, for the right moment to finally bring forward. Ruth drove me to his office herself, and I remember sitting in the passenger seat of her car with my hands pressed flat against my knees, trying to steady a heartbeat that would not slow down, wondering what could possibly still be waiting for us this deep into a fight that had already reshaped my entire understanding of my own family. Mr. Castellano met us in a small conference room with Priya already seated at the table, a thin sealed envelope and an unmarked flash drive resting in front of him like objects he had been guarding for weeks. He explained, carefully, that 4 months before her death, Eleanor Whitfield had come to his office alone, on a day with no scheduled appointment, and asked him to do something unusual. She had asked him to record a video statement, notarized and witnessed properly, along with a sealed duplicate will, both to be held in strict confidence and released only under one specific circumstance. If anyone ever formally challenged the validity of whatever will surfaced after her death, he was to bring both documents forward immediately. I felt the room tilt slightly around me. My grandmother had not simply suspected something might happen. She had built an entire contingency for it, quietly, methodically, months in advance, trusting her own instincts about her son more than she had ever let any of us see. Mr. Castellano played the video for us there in that conference room. I will not try to describe every detail of watching my grandmother's face fill that small screen, alive and clear-eyed and steady in a way that made my chest ache with a grief I thought I had already fully felt. She spoke plainly, the way she always did, saying that she loved all of her family deeply, including Gerald, but that she had watched him grow increasingly evasive and financially strained over the previous year, and that a mother's love did not make her blind to what desperation sometimes pushes a person toward. She said she was leaving this recording not out of suspicion alone, but out of care, so that if her worst fear ever came true, her real wishes would not be lost in the confusion that might follow. Her real will, the sealed duplicate, divided the estate evenly between me and Denny, with a specific, carefully structured trust fund set aside entirely for his ongoing care, naming a professional trustee to manage it so that no family member would ever again hold the kind of unchecked control over his security that had nearly cost him everything. She had even, in a detail that undid me completely, left a modest allowance for Gerald within that same true will, smaller than what he would have received under normal division, but not nothing, a quiet acknowledgement that she still loved her son even while protecting everyone else from the worst version of what fear could make him do. I sat in that conference room and finally understood the full shape of what my grandmother had done. She had not simply been careful. She had been merciful, right up until the very edge of what mercy could reasonably hold. The court scheduled an emergency mediation session for the following week, and I walked into that room with a steadiness I could not have imagined possessing 2 months earlier. Gerald was already seated when we arrived, his attorney beside him, and I watched something in his face shift the moment he saw the flash drive in Priya's hand, some final piece of denial finally giving way to the reality he must have known, somewhere underneath all of it, was always going to catch up to him eventually. Priya played the video for the mediator, for Gerald, for everyone assembled in that room. I watched my uncle listen to his own mother's voice describe her fear of exactly what he had done, and I watched him break in a way that had nothing performative about it, nothing like the careful evasions he had offered in every phone call up to this point. He put his face in his hands and did not lift it for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. He said he had never meant for any of it to reach this far. He said the balloon payment had been eating him alive for over a year, that he had convinced himself, in the specific twisted logic of someone drowning, that his mother would have given him the money herself if she had known how desperate things had become, that forging her signature felt, in the moment, like simply speeding up a conversation she would have eventually agreed to anyway. He said he told himself Denny would be fine, that the state would help, that I was successful enough not to need the money, small lies stacked on top of each other until they built a wall high enough to hide behind. I did not feel triumphant listening to him say all of this. I felt something quieter and sadder, the specific grief of watching a person confirm, out loud, exactly how far fear can push someone away from who they actually are. The resolution moved quickly after that confession. The forged will was formally voided by the court. The true will, verified by Mr. Castellano and supported by Eleanor's recorded testimony, was accepted in its place. Gerald faced a formal referral for probate fraud, along with an order to repay the legal costs the estate had incurred fighting his forged document, a debt that, combined with his failed business and the balloon payment he had never managed to cover, left him with almost nothing of the empire he had tried so desperately to save. In a detail that felt like its own quiet justice, the modest allowance Eleanor had left him in her true will, the portion he could have simply had if he had only waited, if he had only asked instead of forged, was the one part of the estate he formally forfeited as part of his fraud settlement. The very thing he destroyed everything trying to secure faster had been sitting there for him all along, waiting on the other side of honesty he could not bring himself to choose. Denny moved back into the house within the month, this time with full legal protection and a properly funded trust ensuring no single family member could ever again hold that kind of unchecked power over his safety. I watched him wheel through the front door of that house for the first time since the funeral, watched him touch the doorframe the way you touch something you were not sure you would ever get to touch again, and I understood, standing there beside him, that this had never really been about money at all. It had been about a promise our grandmother made to him with her whole life, and the fight to make sure that promise outlived her. As for Ruth, I want to tell you about the last part of this story carefully, because it deserves more than a simple ending line. We did not have a single dramatic moment where everything shifted into romance. It happened slowly, the way real things happen, built out of 100 small accumulated details rather than one grand gesture. It was built out of late nights at her kitchen table surrounded by documents. It was built out of the specific, steady way she showed up without being asked, again and again, through the worst months of my life. It was built out of the fact that she remembered, without me ever telling her twice, the exact date of Eleanor's death, and showed up that evening months after the case had closed with takeout from the same small restaurant Eleanor used to love, not making a production of it, simply setting it down on the table and saying she thought I might not want to be alone that particular night. I looked at her across that table, in a kitchen that had slowly become as familiar to me as my own, and I understood that I had fallen in love with her sometime during all of it, not in a single moment I could point to, but gradually, the way trust always grows when someone proves themselves reliable in exactly the moments reliability matters most. I did not have to tell her that first. She already knew. She had known, I think, for weeks. She simply reached across the table, the same way I had reached for her hand the night we first named what this case had really cost Gerald, and this time she did not let go. We are not a dramatic couple. We do not need grand declarations, because we built this on something steadier than declarations, on showing up, on staying, on choosing each other quietly and repeatedly through the hardest stretch of my life rather than the easiest. That, I have come to believe, is its own kind of romance, the kind that does not announce itself loudly because it does not need to. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself holding your breath through Gerald's confession or feeling that quiet ache when Denny touched the doorframe of his home again, I would love for you to stay with me. I tell these stories because I believe the people who fight quietly, who stay steady through betrayal instead of giving up on the truth, deserve to have their stories told all the way through to the end. Subscribe if you want to walk through more of them with me, because there are many more families, many more quiet fights for truth, still waiting to be told. Denny still teases me, to this day, that it took a forged will and a forensic investigation for me to finally ask someone out. I tell him I prefer to think of it as thorough due diligence. He tells me our grandmother would have found the whole thing absolutely hilarious. I think, honestly, he might be right. There is one detail I have not told you yet, one I am still sitting with myself. In the sealed envelope Mr. Castellano handed over that day, tucked beneath the true will and the notarized testimony, was a second, smaller envelope, addressed simply to Gerald, in Eleanor's real handwriting, the looping flourish on the tail of the L unmistakable. None of us have opened it yet. I do not know what it says. I do not know if I ever will. But I think about it more often than I expected to, and I wonder, some nights, whether the last thing my grandmother ever wrote might be the one thing capable of finally bringing her son back to who he used to be.